I'm Phil Rickaby, and I've been a writer and performer for almost 30 years. But I've realized that I don't really know as much as I should about the theatre scene outside of my particular Toronto bubble. Now, I'm on a quest to learn as much as I can about the theatre scene across Canada. So join me as I talk with mainstream theatre creators you may have heard of and indie artists you really should know, as we find out just what it takes to be Stageworthy. If you value the work that I do on Stageworthy, please consider leaving a donation either as a one-time thing or on a recurring monthly basis. Stageworthy is created entirely by me, and I give it to you free of charge with no advertising or other sponsored messages. Your continuing support helps me to cover the cost of producing and distributing the show. Just 4 people donating $5 a month would help me cover the cost of podcast hosting alone. Help me continue to bring you this podcast. You can find a link to donate in the show notes, which you can find in your podcast app or at the website at stageworthy.ca. Now, on to the show. Michael Ross Albert is a playwright, screenwriter, indie producer, dramaturg, educator, and all-around theater lover. He joined me to talk about his latest play, Good Old Days, appearing this summer at the Toronto Fringe, having 4 productions in 3 countries on 2 continents in 2022, the magic trick behind his play, The Huns, and much more. Here's our conversation. Just to get started properly, I want to talk about your new show that's going to be at the Toronto Fringe, Good Old Days. Tell me, what can you tell me about Good Old Days?
We're recording in mid-May, and the Fringe is still a couple of months away. So I am still in the process of, discovering just exactly what Good Old Days is about. That's not to say, it is not written. There's several drafts completed, and I've been started to work on it with, the creative team. But the script is still, taking shape, and will continue to evolve during the rehearsal process. So all of that to say, this is the week where I'm meant to, submit our 100-word blurb about the play and what the play is. So this is really excellent practice for me, succinctly, describing this piece. I guess you could say that Good Old Days is a surrealist, kind of trippy, dream, life, adventure, chase about the fractured world that we live in. The story of 2 former roommates and former friends whose relationship ended during the pandemic, as many friendships and close relationships were strained. Theirs was strained past the breaking point. And in the middle of the night, on a very strange evening in the city, the 2 of them chase one another, in a way of attempting to mend their fractured relationship. And throughout the night, they encounter various strangers with whom they have interactions that become wonderful and weird and also a little nightmarish. And what the play thematically, I guess, is trying to do is look at this kind of era-defining trauma that we've all lived through, in relation to what we perceive to be a simpler time just 3 years ago, and questions, if things were ever great, if good old days were that, and it also asks us to think about, to look at relationships that have bent past the breaking point over the course of this traumatic event, and see when there's room for reconciliation and how we might go about beginning a conversation about how to encounter one another again from with all of the lessons and all of the experiences that we've learned and encountered over the last few years. So that's a very that won't fit into 100 words in the but that is the idea.
I mean, relationships when you live together, roommates, whether you are a couple or whether you're just roommates, those relationships are fraught as it is. There's, you learn so much about somebody when you live with them. And pre-pandemic, you had time away from your roommate. And then all of a sudden, you did not. And so then things become much more fraught, and the danger to the relationship when you truly see who that person is. For example, you find out that your roommate says things on calls like, let's circle back on that. And you're like, how can I be living with somebody who says, let's circle back, or whatever, like corporate speak that somebody is saying, and suddenly you're like, I'm really annoyed by this person.
Yeah. And it's those little like peccadillos that you can excuse for a while, when you have space from one another. But, as many people I'm sure have encountered over the course lockdown after lockdown, things can really start, the smallest things can start to get under your nerves and under your skin.
Yeah.
And the big things, are so much more, egregious because personal safety and like public duty are at stake.
Mm-hmm.
The play isn't meant to be preachy in that way, but does really, I think, take a look at that, a line that people needed to draw themselves, and the value system that they had to create, and the conflicts that differences in those value systems may have created.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you're spending 24 hours a day with somebody in a space that you did not intend and was never intended to be like a live workspace, but
Right.
Suddenly, like, you've both set up offices in the living room or whatever. It's like, it's no wonder that a relationship would be so fraught and start to fray, and especially if like you're unable to escape the person.
Yes, absolutely. It's a really extraordinary thing that we lived through.
Mm-hmm.
And over the last year, I've had the the opportunity to travel to different places, and no one has a story that doesn't involve some kind of completely out of the ordinary set of circumstances. No one in the world was just like, yeah, things remained the same for me. Yeah. Everyone really had to get used to a whole different reality. And we've come out on the other side of it, or are nearing the other side of it, in this world that to me lately feels quite unrecognizable. And I'm not sure how much of that is me, how much of it is, I like being on the lookout for something that's askew, and how much of it is, it's the reality that we're living in, that things have gotten more difficult, and relationships, with people you're close to have become more fraught, and encounters with strangers have become more strange and hostile. And so, the play kind of, I think, tries to take that neuroses, those neuroses of mine, and theatricalize it in a somewhat surrealistic way.
I mean, it's surreal, yes, but I mean, let's face it. If you're wandering around the streets, you're like, let's say, you're chasing your former roommate through the streets or whatever, and not in a dangerous way, but anyway, Toronto can be a weird place after dark, and the later it goes, the weirder it gets, and so things can get surreal without even really trying if you're out late enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And that has always been the case. It's a big city, and I guess I complain a lot that Toronto isn't necessarily as weird as it used to be, but there's something, but weird is different than strange, or weird is different than dangerous. And so that's the that's what I am hoping to explore. I've been thinking a lot about artistic movement that happened after the First World War and the ensuing pandemic, and art got really weird. The Surrealist Manifesto, which was published 99 years ago, talks about how in a world without meaning, or a world that's lost any semblance of meaning, why should we attempt these realistic depictions of the environment that we find ourselves in? And that, when I'm in school or studying art, I never really got it. And I've been thinking a lot more about how, I like things going through a monumental experience like we all have.
Yeah.
Can really reframe your perspective about the world and the kind of work that you want to make in it.
Yeah.
So that's the experiment.
Yeah.
It's stylistically it feels like a departure from the type of stuff I've written in the past, where people hang out in a room and solve a problem or try to within real time. And this and this play does not do that. So yeah, we're in an experimental land.
There, the movement that you're talking about after World War I and the 1918 flu, was I think, you know, it's a response to, first off, you have an entire generation of young men and people who've been through one of the most traumatic experiences of their lives, and that they refuse to talk about. And so, you know, they don't tell their families about it. It's like this thing that they keep inside, and it comes out in other ways.
Yes.
In some cases, it comes out in fantasy novels, like The Lord of the Rings is full of World War I imagery,
Yes.
and things like that. And then you follow that up with a pandemic, where you have to, people have to stay inside with their thoughts when they were distracting themselves with work and other things and all that sort of stuff. The surrealist movement completely makes sense as it does now, to sort of like try to get out of the constraints of the one room, you know, here where this play is set in a living room or in a kitchen or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And also I think sometimes after a while of trying to keep a play within one space, I think part of the writer sort of chafes at that and sort of wants to try to break out and do something a little bigger. For you, do you find that, or have you found that this was like, you was like sort of breaking out of the room to try to do something bigger and more surreal, or was it a conscious choice?
It was a conscious choice. Cass Van Wyck, who is producing the play, and will be acting in it, as she has with many of my fringe productions. She got into lottery. She got selected in the lottery once again. I don't know how. And we sat down to talk in the winter about what we are hoping to accomplish with an opportunity that we've been given multiple times in the past. What are our goals? What are the things we do accomplish in this moment or at this stage of our lives? For Cass, her priorities are about giving performance opportunities to artists that have either recently graduated from university programs and haven't had the opportunity to be seen in front of a larger audience yet, or are new to the city, or she's very generous in that way of like wanting to provide the opportunities. And for myself, I thought that I think I always tend to set up a little writing challenge for myself, or create a strict set of rules or parameters rather for each play. And I basically said I want to throw those rules out the window. That I had recently written two very large ensemble pieces that were set in real time. And I felt like realism was something I was becoming very confident in as a genre or as a style. And that if we were really going to embrace the experimental and the challenge of fringe, if I really wanted to like rise to what that could be, I thought I need to work in an arena that I'm not as familiar with. And so the idea to do something that has not direct address monologues, but has some form of narration or scene changes or actors playing multiple characters and breaking conventions of logic sometimes. I got really excited by the opportunity to do that. And so that's what we're doing. I wrote a strange play, and it's meant to be performed by two actors, and the actor who will be performing with Cass is named Brianna Wright, and she is a wonderful recent graduate TMU who Cass saw in the indie general auditions that were held at the Assembly Theater earlier in the year, or late last year, whenever the winter was. So it's great that we set these goals back in January, and we're doing it.
Now, in terms of like setting up like challenges for yourself, I want to talk about the Huns for a second.
Sure.
Or maybe more than a second, because I think when we first sat down to talk about the Huns, you referred to
the good old days.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, you were like, there's this magic trick that I have in this show, and I don't know if it's going to work.
Yeah.
And that's all you said. That's all you said, was that there's this magic trick. And the magic trick, I think we can now say, was the fact that the people on stage were interacting with pre-recorded voices that did not feel in the moment like pre-recorded voices. And I have to say that particular trick, to have to work with a stage manager, a sound person who's going to be able to be a scene partner for the actors on stage, that must have been something like from the beginning that was like difficult to arrange and to have happen. How do you find?
Yeah.
Like, what was that? What's that rehearsal process like? To make that happen?
Before we get to the rehearsal, I should say that about 20 pages into the writing of the play, I did send a message around saying, I don't actually know that we will be able to pull this off. And like maybe we should lower our expectations for ourselves. But I think without any risk, there can be no reward. And part of the challenge of stage, or rather the challenge of pulling off this magic trick was incredibly satisfying artistically. And watching the cast perform the play was like watching them walk a tightrope, because I think the audience could tell, like, if something goes wrong, it's gonna go really wrong. And so it really did feel like a great, I mean, it was a lot of pressure, especially for our superhero of a stage manager on that production, Aidan Hammond. But it was, it really did feel like a great sleight of hand trick. And the rules. So the rehearsal process involved recording the voices from 12 actors before rehearsals even began. We only gave each actor their own lines and very little context. Marie Farsi, the director of the play, had maybe 10 minutes with everyone individually, and would direct, and we would sort of like have a script handy. There are kind of movements in the play the characters respond to. And so we could easily say, okay, things are getting a bit tense in this movement. So the line, could you repeat that, please? Like, this is a more tense moment. Can that be heightened a bit? So we got the recordings from those actors and needed them, in QLab for the entire rehearsal run.
Mm-hmm.
So our sound designer was Andy Trithart, who edited the voices. All of this must have happened before we met rehearsal. And in the room, Aiden, the stage manager, would, like, in addition to notating, blocking, and doing all of the other things a stage manager does, hit the QLab button and get into a groove with the actors and learn the moments where delaying by a moment could increase some tension.
Right.
And so, like, it was a very essential part of the rehearsal process, and one that both Marie and myself had to learn before we went to Brighton, given the fact that a pandemic was still raging, especially in the UK.
Yeah.
And so we had to have a contingency plan and learn how to call the show, or how to run the sound through the show, which is not easy.
Now, I mean, now as an audience member who saw the show and didn't know what the magic trick was, there is that tension that you're talking about, that you mentioned, of the audience being like, if something goes wrong, something's going to go really wrong. I think as an audience member, because sometimes when you're watching a show, you have that, like, the same as watching a like an actual magic show. How do they do that? And I think a lot of audience members, because I went through the process of, these people must be backstage. No, that's not possible. They couldn't possibly be backstage. Oh, it's pre-recorded. And then you sort of like are like, oh shit, this is like somebody is like hitting basically play on a thing, and the stress sort of goes up as you, like, subconsciously. Not that it's something you're thinking about, but it's something that is sort of like there in the back of your mind, which is a fascinating thing to sit in, because you're watching the play and the play is tense, but there's an added layer of tension to it, which just sort of adds to the internal tension of the play.
Yes. And I think that there are some, like, horrifically comedic voice performances in that piece.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the voices gets the biggest laugh every show, in a way that's, like, quite unfair to the onstage actors. But without fail, when Tyrone Savage in his British accent says, "Is everything all right?" It, like, has always brought the house down.
Right.
And so, I think that there is an appreciation of the technical wizardry that's required. And those voices really serve a helpful function in creating tension in a play that is essentially three people sitting around a conference room table.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was the particular challenge for me in that piece was, can I make three people sitting around a table be tense and dramatically compelling? And I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to stress so many people out that way.
I think it doesn't help, doesn't hurt that pretty much everybody has been in a conference room in a tense situation. So there's like that immediate like, oh shit, I know this situation.
Yeah. There's a real dance of passive aggression.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I don't know how this happened, but because the revival of the play happened after the pandemic, whereas beforehand, people that worked in offices could relate pretty immediately to the circumstances, whereas people who don't need to regularly do conference calls or any video messaging software could relate to the grind of the piece, the millennial malaise. Whereas after the pandemic, where we have all had to encounter frustrating Zoom meetings and even just like hangouts with friends, I went to a bris on Zoom. Like we all really became fatigued and annoyed, and I think it got tenser after back to the real world.
Yeah. Now you mentioned going to Brighton. Now initially you were supposed to go to Brighton in 2020, I believe.
We sure were.
And of course things happened.
We received our Canada Council travel grant on April Fool's 2020.
Oh, that's devastatingly perfect.
Yeah. It was the first time I laughed in about 3 weeks. We found out and I actually like collapsed on the floor laughing. But we were very, very lucky to receive that funding and to have been able to continue to defer it until we were able to finally cross the pond. And it was so wonderful. It was after years of just like not knowing what was going to happen with life, let alone with making theater, to be able to go on an adventure to the other side of the ocean, to live in an Airbnb with people who have become close friends, like family, and do a show for strangers who laughed and liked and didn't have to say nice things to us because they didn't were. So it was really like one of the most memorable moments, experiences, and something I'm cherished forever.
I mean, I was going to ask about the audience reaction to the show, this Canadian show in England, but obviously it translated and people got it.
It did, and what's funny is that the audiences, it seemed like the audiences were a bit quieter than we had been used to, and at the end of the show were incredibly enthusiastic, or would come up to us at the bar or post about the show online. But we were like, you can laugh about like British people have, like, they do comedy, don't they? And I think there's something so it made us kind of reflect on the institution of British comedy, which is so so wonderfully and unambiguously silly.
Mm-hmm.
And this play, in a very Canadian way, is like a bit humble about its laughs. Maybe it's like sly. You know, where like it feels like the laughs are coming from something uncomfortably familiar rather than something outsized and slapstick and big. And so Tyrone's line still always got a really big laugh.
Mm-hmm.
Is everything all right? But we found it was we found it really became like a drama in the youth. And perhaps it has something to do with the circumstances of the world at the time we performed it for a second time, but it did feel like quite a tense experience for the audience.
Audiences are weird. And, I say that because, every audience is different. And, you go to a place and you're not sure what an audience is going to be like. Years ago, when I was working with Keystone Theater, we were doing plays in the style of silent film. Because the actors on stage were not talking, a lot of times audiences had this involuntary response that it took them a long time to figure out, oh, I'm allowed to laugh. Yeah. And so they would be really quiet at first, and then after somebody laughed, they would suddenly realize, oh yes, I can make noise. And it's interesting to watch an audience make that discovery. And then, when you take a play, say, to England, and it's sort of like when people come here or people go to a different place and the accent, they have a dialect, maybe the audience is quiet because they're like, I need to concentrate because this is an unfamiliar dialect to me, or something like that. You never know what it's going to be, but, as long as at the end they react in the way that you want them to, that's awesome. Did you feel like it was that it was maybe the dialect, or was it just the fact that maybe it was just pandemic-y?
I wish I could tell you what, or put my finger on it. I'm not sure that this is, that this had anything to do with it, but we did begin the show with a land acknowledgement that I don't think the colonizers, the OG colonizers are used to hearing. And it was, and so there was a part of me that wondered that perhaps that was a bit, baffling or just, they began scratching their heads before the play started. But it's not to say that they weren't, involved. And it could, we were in a reasonably sized house, and had reasonably sized audiences. And I'm not sure. It's not to say that they didn't, I'm not saying it didn't go well. The response was really good, but it was a little perplexing to everyone that we would be doing this show that here in Toronto would get big, enthusiastic laughs throughout. There is a moment in the play where I think the tension has ramped up to a boiling point and is diffused momentarily by it. And once that tension breaks, they were a bit more willing to vocalize their laughter. But at that point, the play takes a bit a turn towards more serious thematic content. So the laughter is not necessarily, maybe by the time they realized they could laugh, it wasn't time for them to laugh anymore. It's, like you said, audiences are weird. And, what I'm so grateful for is that people who had no reason to see this bunch of Canadians took time out of their day to get stressed out with us, and were so kind and welcoming, and told their friends to see it. We had these wonderful actors came to see it, and later did a post-show announcement about our play in the most like beautiful, emphatic terms. We had people, young people. This is maybe my favorite story, but they like were coming in from London to do fringe stuff, and went back to London, which is about an hour and a half away, and then came back to see the show again the next day. And we were like, just completely floored that that the response was so genuine and so kind.
Yeah. It audiences, every time you go to a place, you have to sort of adjust your expectations. New
Definitely.
audience, you have to try to figure out how is this audience going to react. And it's one of the things that actors, performers, playwrights have to be ready for and have to be flexible with. But you can always tell when an audience is into it. Like, they might not be vocalizing.
Yes.
But the energy in the room tells you that they're with you. And that's always one of the great things about doing theater, and to have people come back and like do all this stuff. That's obviously, the show was really well received. And as far as like, were you familiar with the Brighton Fringe at all before you went, or was it just like
well, we had 3 years to familiarize ourselves, but no, I guess it was only 2. Pardon me. No, it wasn't a fringe that was on my radar. But at the end of the 2019 festival, here in Toronto, we received an invitation to take the show, and began, like a real research campaign of looking at what available venues were, how their festival runs, and the scope and size of it, and box office expectations and attendance expectations. So I think we did, having the luxury of time with that was very useful, and we picked. I think we picked really well in terms of like where we were staying, and where the show was presented, and how it was marketed. I'm sure if we were to do it again, there are things we would do differently. But like, it's a really fun town. First of all, it's probably, I think it's known as one of the most progressive cities in the UK or in England. And so there's a real like party vibe, as much as there can be in Britain. But people come for their bachelorette parties, whatever you call them over there. And there's very dramatic scenery, and like a great midway, and really just like excellent food, vegan options, all of the things a bunch of North American millennials could have hoped for.
That's perfect.
I think we realized how North American we are, especially being the energy and efficiency that's required for the Toronto Fringe.
Mm-hmm.
We really like brought that with us and realized very quickly that there is a much more lackadaisical attitude
Right.
towards the creation of art in, in that. I don't know if it's that particular festival or in the UK, but we were like, it didn't take us very long to realize we're at a 12 and they're about an 8.
Yeah. But that's one of those things that if you're traveling to fringe festivals, if you're going to more than one fringe festival, each one is different, and you don't know, like, you'll go to one, is this a flyering town? And the only way to find out is to try to flyer, unless somebody has told you in advance. And then you might be like, well, we don't need these flyers anymore. But, there's all kinds of like differences. And so every place is different. And to find out that you're running it, I don't know. I wonder if they were like, these North Americans are really quite intense.
They were. Yep, they sure were.
But it sounds like it was a great experience. You guys had you got to stay together and you did, I think, one day trip into London and had a great time. It sounds like, yeah.
Yeah, we really had a blast. It was a very memorable experience. Even the difficult parts, like trying to leave the UK during the week of the Queen's Jubilee, which you've never done before. I guess you won't get a chance to now.
But no, but one probably you. So I take it you don't recommend doing so.
It was a low point of the trip. But it's truly something I'll never forget.
Yeah. Now, just sort of in as we sort of start to come to a close here, interesting factoid is that this summer will be the 5th time that a play of yours is produced at the Toronto Fringe.
That is correct.
And that's a pretty good record. That's a pretty good record in the Toronto Fringe. How do you feel about that sort of milestone?
It's a bit odd. It's not. It makes me feel old, if I'm being perfectly honest. And but it, Fringe has been a really significant part of my artistic career and of the formation of my attitudes about art. And so I'm really glad that I have an opportunity to continue to experiment with something new in this setting. I think Fringe invites risk taking. And, you never know which piece is going to land or strike a chord with audience members. But Fringe gives you the opportunity to fail, really, to like, without the pressure of catering to a commercial audience. You can take big swings and try stuff on for size. And each play that I've done in the Toronto Fringe and in other fringes have all been really like significant like tests for myself, where they're good indicators of where I was at as a person and as a writer at the time of writing. And so I'm really grateful that I have the chance to articulate the strangeness of how it feels to be alive right now in a way that I probably wouldn't have had it not been for the opportunity to perform a play in the Fringe. So, I'm really thrilled. I'm scared. You know, it's a very vulnerable, activity showcasing something that you've written for the public. And there is a risk that it might not be any good. I truly thought, I didn't know what to think about the Huns or anywhere before an audience got into the room. And that's like, it's terrifying that they might run for the exits. And so that fear is a really good motivator. And it means that it requires everyone to work in a way that is truthful and joyful. Because if the Fringe is not fun, it's not worth doing. And so I feel so fortunate that I get to have fun with this creative team. The play is being directed by Jill Harper, who is a director I wanted to work with for years. And she very graciously sat down with me in the winter where I didn't do a good job at articulating what the play would be at all, and said, yeah, let's do it. Let's make something weird. So I appreciate that everyone dives in. Everyone is embracing the spirit of risk taking that's involved with on a show in the Fringe Festival. And I'm glad I get to do it for a 5th time. How lucky. Like,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that you've had this experience, and I have, when, you're presenting something new and there's a moment, early on or something, if it's a comedy or something, you're waiting for a reaction. You're like, if I get this reaction, I know that it's funny. We think it's funny from rehearsal, but the audience will tell us. And there's almost like a subconscious holding of the breath until like you get that reaction. And then you can sort of be like, okay, that moment passed. That was the litmus test. The audience likes it. We're good to go.
Well, and some performances, the audience will laugh, and some they won't. Some are late at night when the audience has had a couple before the show, and some are in the middle of the day. Like, there's something really, there's something ephemeral about, like, inherently about theater, but because of the scheduling that's all over the place, really invite variety in the house, and play will be different, and that's so cool.
Yeah. It's a great lesson about theater in general, that like a real concrete reminder that these words with these actors with that audience will never happen again. And this reaction is unique to this moment. And it's sort of like you go in and you let it happen, and hopefully everybody has fun.
Amen.
Well, Michael, I'm really looking forward to, as always, I'm always excited to see a new show that you've written. So I'm really looking forward to good old days at on the Fringe.
Thank you so much, Phil, and thanks for talking to me.
This has been an episode of Stageworthy. Stageworthy is produced, hosted, and edited by Phil Rickaby. That's me. If you enjoyed this podcast and you listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can leave a 5-star rating. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can also leave a review. Those reviews and ratings help new people find the show. If you want to keep up with what's going on with Stageworthy and my other projects, you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to philrickaby.com/subscribe. And remember, if you want to leave a tip, you'll find a link to the virtual tip jar in the show notes or on the website. You can find Stageworthy on Twitter and Instagram at StageworthyPod, and you can find the website with the complete archive of all episodes at stageworthy.ca. If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Phil Rickaby, and as I mentioned, my website is philrickaby.com. See you next week for another episode of Stageworthy.